Well, hello there, friend. Welcome back to the Construction Leadership Podcast. I am your host, Bradley Hartman. Now, in this episode, my friend, you will discover one of the most important assets that is available to all of us to help us individually in our own careers, personally and professionally, and certainly our companies competing in the marketplace do that better. And this is the availability of story and how we can craft story that resonates with people, that increases our stature in the industry and helps us ultimately grow our influence and lead other people better, serve other people better. And to have this conversation with me is someone that I've been working with for the last year and a half or so. His name is Mr. Paul Kix. He's an American journalist and author. He graduated from the Iowa State University. Mascot is the Cyclones. He worked at ESPN.com and was a deputy editor at ESPN, the magazine. He has written 2 books, the first of which is The Saboteur, the aristocrat who became France's most daring anti-Nazi commando. Who doesn't want to read that? Well, I have read it, and I would strongly recommend it to a friend. It is non-fiction, but it reads like fiction. It is unbelievable what happened there during the French Resistance in World War II. He also more recently wrote, "You have to be prepared to die before you can begin to live." Long title, incredible book about this 10-week period in 1963 and Martin Luther King and the work that he did with his team to change the course of America. I specifically wanted Paul to join me on this episode to really discuss storytelling in business because he helped me craft this custom construction case study that is now part of CNS 5632, which means nothing to you, but it means a lot to me, and a handful, about 35 students in the University of Oklahoma MBA program specific to construction professionals. We wanted to have some case studies in there that were really relevant, but also were interesting. As you will hear, he's a funny guy. He's a smart guy. He has lots of insights, and he'll make lots of recommendations on things to watch, things to read, and ways that you can immediately improve yourself. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation on storytelling in business with Mr. Paul Kix. As always, thank you for listening.
Put that coffee down.
Creators are leaders. Be careful what kind of leaders you're producing here.
Helen, we're both in sales. Let me tell you why I suck as a salesman.
They realized that to be in power, you didn't need guns or money or even numbers. You just needed the will to do what the other guy wouldn't.
I'm not leaving. The show goes on.
Mr. Paul Kix, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Excited you're here. We're going to jump right in. I want to know, you worked at a couple different places in different domains that specialize in incredible storytelling, Disney, ESPN. What, for our audience, right off the bat, like what stands out to you of like one of the biggest insights or lessons that you learned about great storytelling from working at those places and putting out stories from within those organizations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple of ways to answer it. The first is that storytelling is not only eternal, but everybody is basically telling him or herself a story at all times. And so if you can understand how to tell a story well, and this now segues into the second part of what I learned there, you can make real world revenue from that. Like, sometimes when I go and give a public presentation now, especially at a place where they kind of think, it's storytelling's kind of foo-foo and we don't really need to focus on it here. I'm like, no, let me tell you, it's basically at the heart of what you should be focusing on. And I, of course, sort of instinctually understood that as a journalist, but really as I climbed higher at ESPN and then had sort of projects that I would take on that would have roles that I was interacting with other Disney executives and helping to shape certain projects and initiatives within that realm, I began to see how central storytelling was at the highest levels, right? And how much the best executives realized if we tell a good story, we make 5x, 10x, 100x, 1,000x, a million X times more. And if you just think about the ways that like Disney itself has a great movie that's released, and then just to get sort of mercenary about it, the branding that then exists around that, the products that then exist around that, ultimately the rides at Walt Disney World that, arise from that, you see how, if you really focus on storytelling, there really is no end to the financial gain.
Have things changed in terms of humans and technology and the duration with which humans these days will have attention for a specific story? Or what have you learned along that? Because I hear people say this all the time. They're like, if you don't get him within the first 2 seconds, you're done. And I'm like, well, I just went and watched a movie, actually the new Mufasa movie. And I don't know, I thought it was good. I paid attention the entire time. How did that happen? I gave it a lot more than 2 seconds. What have you learned from that?
It's primarily that people will follow you for however long the story is interesting. And so this comes back to, has technology changed attention spans? No, I would argue actually it has not. What technology has done is allowed that many more people to be present on that many more platforms. And so poor storytellers are going to always have a hard time hooking people and getting them to stay. Great storytellers are going to have no problem whatsoever. And it's not just like the Mufasa movie you referenced. Like, think of like, we're kind of emerging from this period right now, but think of like peak TV, right? When you would watch a television series for 5, 6, 7 different seasons. Now, the best of those, and I'm thinking of like The Wire, I'm thinking of The Sopranos, I'm thinking of Mad Men. There's a long list of shows that were absolutely phenomenal. Better Call Saul. The audience had no problem sticking around with that. The audience has no problem even in this realm right now, listening to a great either 3-hour podcast, if it's interesting, if there's a story, if there's something that's useful that's being relayed, or for that matter, a serialized podcast. There's a whole serialized podcast industry now. There used to just be This American Life. Now there's literally like, and I know this because I work, adjacent to this field, there's literally like tens of thousands of jobs where long form writers like myself can realize, oh my gosh, like there's a whole other, again, platform on which we can really hone our craft.
Can you tell me about any sort of example, maybe from ESPN? Because I remember getting the magazine, and maybe not every issue, but it was not uncommon to have, my guess would be, 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 word stories. Do you have any experience on what you found there where you were able to kind of prove that, hey, this story, it is longer. However, this can work and people will follow along, whether that's in the magazine, which I guess is probably harder to measure, but you can, I'm sure, but certainly online.
Yeah. So I was at ESPN, the magazine, in some capacity for 17 years. The last 10 of that as an editor and writer, and increasingly as an editor with ever more responsibilities. And I was directly involved, to answer your question, with pieces that ran in excess of 25,000 words. And we had executives above us, and I want to actually call out one of them, John Skipper, the former president of ESPN, who had before ESPN been the publisher of Rolling Stone, like during one of its heydays, and really understood that great storytelling is transformative and also, to use this phrase again, eternal. So it doesn't matter the platform. And so we would routinely run, like, to take this 25,000 word piece. It was about New Orleans 10 years after Hurricane Katrina, really only tangentially related to sports. That was, may it rest in peace, one of the greatest things about ESPN, the magazine. It was really much more about sports as a metaphor for the American experience, sports as a metaphor for the human condition. We didn't really give a crap about, like, yay, who won last night. So in any case, that story, I was the editor who worked on it with the writer Wright Thompson, one of the greatest writers. I think it's to say he's the greatest sports writer is one thing. To say he's one of the greatest American writers is probably more appropriate. But in any case, Wright and I worked on that story for months. And when it was published, the release was one where it dominated ESPN.com's homepage. And this at a time when all of our competitors were saying, no, it's a push to digital, it's a push to short, it's a push to short form video, which is something that still you hear a lot of today. And I just think, like, perhaps now more than ever, I think people yearn for something that is not, well, if you can tell a story in 30 seconds, fantastic. And there's lots of great examples of that. But also, I think deep down inside, people yearn for something that helps them understand how to live. And the best stories really do that in some way. They end up being reflections of who that person is, who the person hearing that is, who the person reading that is. Just real quickly, one of my favorite quotes from John Steinbeck in East of Eden talks about this exactly. He has a character say what I believe is really sort of the guiding ethos of Steinbeck's career itself. One of the characters in that novel says, every story is never about the story itself. It's always about the way that the reader interprets it. It's always about the reader in some sense. It's always about you. And I have been in my own career sort of guided by that through the stories I tell and anything else that I try to do to help others tell stories.
Well, I think that's a good transition because we're always talking about to our clients and our friends and thinking about our own business is that at the end of the day, our job is to serve a customer, to make their lives better in some way, to make them better in some way. And it's not about us, right? It's about them. And when companies get in and talking about their locations and their history and their new CEO, dude, no one cares. Everyone's got their own needs and fears and pains that we talk about. You mentioned something that I want to dig into. You mentioned that everyone's got a story playing in their own head, and sometimes that serves them, my guess is, and sometimes it doesn't. You grew up as a sixth generation farmer in Iowa.
Yep.
My guess is there was some story that would have liked to continue on, and yet you, as far as I know, sir, are not farming currently today. Maybe tell me about what story did you grow up with? And at what point did you say, I'm going to tell myself another story that I want to be a storyteller?
Yeah. So I was fortunate in two respects. The first is that I had parents who realized that, especially a father who realized that I need not follow him into the family business, especially if it was something that I didn't want to do. And it wasn't that I didn't enjoy being with my dad. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy baling hay. Point is, I could do that, but he knew I never wanted to do that. So the first story was really one where he's like, okay, Paul, I'll allow you to tell basically the story you want to tell yourself. And it would be much, much later until I realized the significance of that choice. I went to a crap public high school in rural Iowa. Two of my high school classmates were dead inside a year. Two more were arrested for meth possession inside a year, right? So I did a decent job, but for my first 20 years of my professional career, it was entirely rooted in I'm going to show them. And that story served me, got me to bylines in the New Yorker and the Atlantic and that job at ESPN and books and all of that. But eventually, to segue to the second part of that you were just asking, I realized around age 40 that this story was no longer serving me. And I also realized at age 40, and this was the shocking thing, that I was telling myself this story and I didn't even realize it. It's kind of ironic, but I didn't know that there was a story in my head that I was telling myself. I just thought it was the inner monologue that I had. And it took a few different things for me to realize that this was a story I was telling myself. But then it also took for me to realize that I can change that story. And once I began to realize, oh my gosh, I can change that story, it began to change everything. Around that time, among other things, I was reading, well, first off, I was completely on my own. I was laid off from ESPN by that point. So who do I want to be now that I'm 40? But more than that, it was I was reading a lot of books that really influenced me, a lot of wisdom books, the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita. I read a biography of Emerson that had a huge influence on my life. It's called Emerson, The Mind on Fire. And what Emerson basically argued is what old Vedic texts did from about 3,000 years ago, which is our thoughts influence what we say influences how we act influences our behavior, how we behave is how we live. And if you can change your thoughts, you can change your life. And that's when I realized, oh my gosh, there's actually storytelling here that so I began to say, how can I tell myself a better story? And when I talk with people in the business world, especially business leaders, it may, again, sound a little bit like, is this some sort of therapy session? But no, it's really if you want to lead well, you have to first realize there is a story that's going on inside your head. And does it serve you or does it not? Right. And being able to realize that the story you're telling yourself is the first step to actually making sure your company or your team is telling the proper story about themselves.
So once we understand the story that we're telling ourselves, and I'm kind of translating that to this leadership course that we're working on. I think leadership in general all start from the same place, which is before you start trying to lead other people, take a step back. Are you leading yourself? Do you understand yourself? As we're thinking about businesses and all right, how can I use storytelling to help grow my business, to better serve customers, to reach a wider audience, to be more useful? Once we get beyond the self, is there another set of frameworks to take this from, all right, I feel confident about the story I'm telling myself, and even kind of as myself in terms of this business, what's after that for folks that ultimately want to tell a better story to the marketplace?
Yeah. So the second layer, and we can touch upon this just briefly, is really the story you're telling your team. Because if that team is not into that story, if they don't buy it, there's going to really be no success outside the company walls. So what I like to say is, and this is a line that I've stolen from Alcoholics Anonymous, all progress starts with the truth. Once you understand your own story, then you apply that lesson to the next level, which is, okay, what's the story my team is telling itself? And don't sugarcoat it, right? Like, be honest. Like, are they pleased with where they are? Are they pleased with me? Once people can sort of rally around a leader and or an idea that company and or specifically a story about the company, once they have a sense of, yes, this is our mission. And I can tell you, like, a brief aside here, we had, this is specific to ESPN, but like, this is just a specific example that I think you can be more broadly applied. In our market at that time at ESPN, everybody was again saying short form, short form, short form. And the story that John Skipper told you sort of mid-level people like me was, you know what, let's not tell that story to our audience, and let's not tell that story to ourselves. Let's feature stories on the homepage that are, again, 5, 6, 7, 10,000, 25,000 words in length. And then let's see how the readership responds. And guess what? Those were some of our best trafficked stories all year because we invested in the storytelling. And so that's like, I say that because you may think in your marketplace, well, there's just a way that we do business here, or there's just a way that the business itself works in our space. And surely what you want applied in a place like ESPN in no way reflects what I have to deal with in my line of work. And I'm here to say that's BS, right? Like, again, all progress starts with the truth. So like, what's the story that your team is hearing and how can you best serve them? And then more broadly speaking, be honest with the public. Storytelling is real and it has real world benefits.
What stands out to you in terms of how do we know if the story that we're telling inside is the same one that is being told outside?
Oh, that's a great question. So first off, is the story you're telling inside a reflection of what you're seeing, especially if you're a leader, what you're seeing on a day in, week out sort of basis? And, do you have a sort of line of communication where people are going to be honest with you? We recently watched the Napoleon movie wasn't all that great, but my twin boys were asking questions about Napoleon. And one of the things that's remarkable about Napoleon is eventually he starts to just surround himself with people who he doesn't want to hear anything other than it's going just fine. It helped him in the beginning to defy all expectations until it didn't. You have to eventually get to the point where you're like, okay, I want to make sure that I have open lines of communication. He didn't do that. So I think there's a lot of businesses that fail to do that. Okay, so what kind of story are you telling? I think it's honestly like it's one that speaks to, first off, your strengths, also your weaknesses. If there are weaknesses, do not run away from them. If you're in a position to have any sort of marketing that can reach a wider public, my God, I wish more businesses would do this. You acknowledge that there's a shortcoming. You get there before your competition can. And then you say, here are the ways that we're looking to address that. Man, do people love that level of honesty, right? Like it is so rare to see in the business space, but it's so easy to do now. Like you can do it through YouTube. You can do it like if you have a newsletter that reaches an audience, you can do it that way. You can do it through social media channels, right? Like honesty gets you so much further than another sort of marketing campaign that's glitzy, but is really just glossing over everything. And then after that, it's like, okay, so you're honest, but then, okay, here's the things we're going to do to address it. And by the way, let's not forget the achievements that we've had too. Once you make your own story part of the story you're relaying to the public, then it's that much more captivating. There's a lot of things I don't like about him, but one of my favorite quotes is from Peter Thiel, where he says competition is for losers. And what he means by that is you should be a company, any sort of entity. This is from the smallest of entrepreneurs to the largest of multinational conglomerates, that is really only in competition with itself and wanting to tell a story about itself. Think about, put this in real terms. Think about Apple. Has Apple ever given a crap about Microsoft? No. Apple only says, here's what we're doing now that's cool. And people are like, yeah, that's cool. They don't care what Microsoft is doing. They understand that ethos. And I think when companies do, that's when, again, they really start to thrive, because they've incorporated storytelling in some manner so that their public may consume the same sort of story.
All right. I'm going to take a right turn here. You've made a couple suggestions on books. Before we get there, here's a question, Paul. Any mentor you could have on storytelling, on writing, you run your own small business, could be business, any leader at all you can have access to, and they're going to be your personal mentor, living or dead, Paul. Who comes to mind that you said, this is who I want in Paul Kix's corner, coaching me up for the next year? Who is it?
Living or dead? Well, I mean, I don't think you can go wrong with Jesus. Let's.
All right. Damn. Normally, I take a few off the table. Normally, I'm saying you can't get Abe Lincoln, you can't get George Washington, you can't get Steve Jobs, and you can't get Jesus. Now, I'm not going to go into detail how I removed those 4 from the list. You also can't get Mother Teresa. She would be good.
Can't get Mother Teresa, and so you probably can't get access to Aristotle. You can't get access to any of those people either.
That's right.
Is that right?
What? Maybe I should say this. Maybe non-obvious folks. You mentioned Emerson, by the way, because you recommended it on one of your podcasts from a while back. Yeah. Over here, it is intimidating for a small man like me. That thing looks like at least 600 pages. But I got Emerson, The Mind on Fire, over there. So that's a good kick in the pants for me to get back
Emerson is great. Here's what I would say about Emerson. And I think he's perhaps a good place to start, because he in some ways reflects how I try to lead my life, how I try to lead my business, how I try to think about storytelling. His basic concept is that your life is streaked with the divine in some way. And what he means by that isn't necessarily even a religious, although he is religious, he's a transcendentalist, but it has a secular interpretation too. And it's basically that once you understand that there is something within you that is trying to lead its sort of highest purpose in life, then let that guide you, right? There are far too many people in this world. There are people I worked with at ESPN. There are people I now coach. There were, frankly, I was this way and still frankly struggle against it, who believe that their light should not shine out, right? There's a great quote that I love from Carlos Santana where he says, the biggest cancer on this planet is that most people don't believe in their own light. And I think that that's true. The first thing you have to realize is, what is it that I actually want? What would happen if I put down my fear and tried to lead, tried to start a new business, tried to do whatever? What would that actually look like? Because a lot of times they don't believe in their own light. But Emerson is great because that book and a lot of things he talks about really instills in you this idea that, again, whatever your religious persuasion, or even if you don't have one, you get one shot at this, and let your days be defined in pursuit of the thing that you truly want to do. I mean, you may encounter this just with the people you deal with all the time, but how many business leaders, when you say, well, what do you want? What would it look like? How many times, Bradley, do they hem and haw and say, well, it'd be great if we could have this, but we'll settle for this. Is that I'm assuming it's common. I don't know. Maybe that assumption is wrong.
No, you're 100% right. And as a consultant, it is easy for me to come in and guide that conversation and challenge them, and then, sit alone and shut off the phone and think about this for myself and then our team. Well, that's different. And I think some of this is it's part of human nature and the fear of failure. And sometimes there's a razor thin line between being in a groove and being in a rut. And sometimes the effort and the energy to change directions is just more than people think they can bear.
And a lot of times it's worsened when, say, if you are at a publicly traded company and have some leadership position there, you've seen stocks decline. If you're at a small company, you've had a big setback. If you're by yourself, you're like, oh my God, this is scary as hell. How do I actually make this work? Maybe. And so the instinct is always to go to safety, right? To go to the thing that feels secure. But a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times, like, that security is actually the trap. I really like what you said about that razor thin line between being in the flow and being in a rut, right? Like, being aware that that line exists, and then being aware when you do dip into the rut that there's a way to get out. Man, that's huge. That is huge.
All right, Paul. Enough about you. Let's talk about us. So I came to you, and by the way, we're making this mandatory to our students in the University of Oklahoma MBA program specific to construction professionals. I'm making this a requirement for them to listen to because I think storytelling is so important. As kind of a meta analysis here, I came to you and I said, hey, I want to write a case study that is fictional, but is specifically about construction, about some common challenges that companies in our space have been exposed to, and kind of the ups and downs over the years that they've had. As you were helping me, we can call it developmental editing, we can call it structural editing, we can call it being kind of a literary therapist, however you want to cash the checks, Paul. When I came to you and said, here is what I want to do, which is storytelling in business, what came immediately to your mind as in either, okay, well, this could go really sideways here on this, or hey, this could be interesting. Maybe just share what were some of your candid thoughts when I approached you with the idea?
I honestly freaking loved it. Like, I loved every aspect of it because I've read case studies, right? And so often they're bland and frankly, like, far too short and kind of confusing because you don't really know what's going on. The author of the case studies, without naming names, sometimes don't know how to tell a story. So the fact that, like, you were going to present it over this thing that we ended up calling episodes, and B, that you were going to be like telling this fictional story, I was like, oh my God, I'm all in on this. This is awesome. And so what it basically becomes like is an exercise from there. And like, okay, who are the characters? What's at stake? How do those characters develop? And again, you may think, well, what does this have to do with business? It has everything to do with business, right? Because like, once you understand this is the conflict that this business executive is having at that time, this is the motivation he has to solve it. These are the obstacles he or she, and I shouldn't just say he or she is faced with as they're trying to solve it. That's real life, right? Like there's a reason that storytelling is so essential to us, because like storytelling is life. Like the story is really all we know. So like once you decided I want to do this, I was like, this is awesome. I want to be a part of this.
Well, I kept on thinking about, mainly because you kept on encouraging me to think about it, but in every scene, in every situation between these characters that are in a construction setting, thinking about who are these people as individuals, where do they come from, and in this moment right now, what do they want? And while we weren't writing on the nose to communicate this, like, I think this to a large degree is what leadership is. When someone comes in my office, or I'm trying to sell a new hospital and we want to be the chosen contractor for this developer, is understanding who are these individuals? Who are they? You know, where do they come from and what do they want? Are there other lessons that you think about where you say, yeah, it's storytelling, but this is what I am doing to grow my business and try to figure out who I can help to go from story to, like, this is how I get paid and this is how we win in terms that we define?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for anybody that I try to help as a consultant, the first thing you have to figure out is what's the story that's been going on in their company for a while, and then what's the story they can begin to shape. It comes back to that. But really at the heart of it is what you were just saying a moment before. What's the conflict that you're facing right now? How are you trying to resolve it? Who are your allies? Who are the villains? You can literally frame it in the context of story, because it's real too, right? What's your motivation to succeed here? What's the impediment to success? Again, classic, eternal tenets of storytelling. Also, how is the story useful? How is it something that is benefiting you, the person who's telling it, your team, and the public? Realizing its usefulness is sort of the hallmark of being an effective leader, and trying to realize that like using storytelling as a framework to inspire people is something that's not a hack, but should frankly be like a central feature of your business. You know, if all progress does start with the truth, the more you can put that truth out there and understand it, and I don't even want to say justify it, but simply explain yourself, you're going to either get people who are immediately in, which is great, or immediately out, which is actually fine too, because you want to be able to speak to an audience that is already with you. Like, you're going to make more money that way if your audience buys into that story.
Final question here. Maybe this isn't fair to put this as final, but I'm fascinated just to know what you've learned about coaching adults, being around some great storytellers, some great leaders at ESPN and Disney, what you learned about taking coaching as someone who can improve, and also where you're spending a lot of your time now is coaching other adults. And what have you just learned in general about how to be most effective at taking the coaching to improve yourself, but also dishing it to other people in a way that they will respond and change the behavior and become better themselves, which ultimately, to me, that's leadership.
That's the game. Yeah. So to change yourself, the first thing you have to realize is, well, how exactly do I want to change? And so what is it exactly I would like to go into? Why am I intrigued by this? What happens along the way is you literally meet people who are quite good at this, and you begin to realize if I can sign up for something, and I've signed up, for programs that were well in excess of $10,000. But what I'm doing is I want to take their decades of experience and I want to have it in a matter of days, right? So like, if you don't want to slog through, you can A, read a book, because books are fantastic, one of the biggest returns on investment, but also B, like if you can get access to somebody who knows what they're doing, and if you have interest in the same thing, oh my God, does that ever help you? So that's on the coaching yourself side. You actually have to realize that I need to be coached, which is it's kind of an ego hit, kind of one where you're admitting your vulnerability, but it needs to happen. Now, coaching others, there's a Zen cone that goes when the student is ready, the teacher appears. Right. And how can I best utilize story in a way so that I actually understand the eternal tenets that live beneath all great storytelling and that frankly exist across time and across platform? And how can that then serve what I want to do within my business? Well, then I can say, well, let's have a conversation, because here's what I could tell you on the story side. Here's what I've found in my own experience as an entrepreneur. And by the way, if you're a sort of a big fish, here's what I saw when I was at ESPN and Disney. Only in hindsight, with respect to Disney and ESPN, did I realize, oh my gosh, there were some absolute amazing executives there who really understood, again, that beautiful relationship between storytelling and revenue.
Well, I appreciate you making time. I also appreciate the work that you put out, your newsletter, every single Friday. I'm reading that. And I think our audience, Paul, is one that they want to listen to smart people. They want to learn from smart people. They want to read things that smart people say you should read. So you can drop the humility here for people that have listened to our conversation here and want to learn more about you and what you do and how you help them. In addition to obviously buying the books, they should absolutely do that. And we'll link to those in the show notes there. Be real direct. Tell people where they can follow you and what you want them to do next.
You can go to my website, paulkix.com, and you can find it there. Also, I've recreated something that can benefit you right now by way of like understanding story. It's just sort of like a primer. It doesn't go too deep, but it is, if you don't have any real sense of how to do this, so here's where you're going to go. StorytellingYouKickstarter.com. Again, StorytellingYouKickstarter.com. So you can go there and see how it suits you.
All right. We'll link to those. Paul, thank you. Appreciate the work we do together and appreciate all your help. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been awesome.
All right then, friends, how did that go? Hopefully you enjoyed my conversation with Mr. Paul Kix. If you're interested in learning more, go to Paul, P-A-U-L, Kix, K-I-X, just like the cereal, paulkix.com, paulkix.com. You can learn more. And if you did get value from this episode, please rate and review us on whatever podcast platform you are listening to. That helps us more than you know as we strive to bring our construction community closer together to help us build more productively, safer, and more profitably. And while Paul is working on his third book now, I would strongly recommend you to either buy in print or audiobook his two books. Both of them are great. You can listen to them or read them in any order. The one is The Saboteur, and the other one is You Have to Be Prepared to Die Before You Can Begin to Live. Long title, great book. And in reading these books, I think you're going to find a couple things. Number one, fantastic storytelling with a lot of momentum. Also a ton of leadership principles that you can apply to your own life and more generally to business. All right, friends, I'm done. Thank you for listening. We will close out with our leadership mantra. You are owed nothing. Deliver value first. Make it a great week.